The ring was on her left hand when she passed the green bean casserole, and I had not seen it in 15 years. Easter Sunday, my father's house in Whitmore Heights, for in the afternoon, and the dining room smelled the way it had smelled every Easter since I was a child. Ham and brown sugar. The pollen of grocery store lilies on the sideboard. The faint chemical sweetness of the candles my stepmother bought at the home goods store on Route 6 because she said the expensive ones were a waste. Renee was wearing my mother's ring. Emerald center stone, oval cut, 6 millimeters across, flanked by 2 trillion diamonds. The setting was platinum and the band was thinner than modern bands because it had been my grandmother's first, made in 1952. There was an inscription on the inside that read CW always. CW for Catherine Whitfield. Always for my father, who, sitting at the head of the table in his blue cable knit sweater, was carving the ham as if the woman across from him had not just reached into a grave and pulled something off the bone. My name is Eleanor Whitfield. I am 26 years old. I teach high school chemistry at the public school 3 towns over, and I came home that Easter because my father said it would mean a lot to him, and I had not yet learned that the things my father said would mean a lot to him were almost always things that would cost me. Welcome back to Broken Relations. If you are new here, we tell stories about families, the lies they keep, and the moments those lies stop holding. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and let's get into it. My mother's name was Catherine Whitfield. She was 39 when she died and 38 when she got the diagnosis, and the diagnosis came on a Thursday in October, and the Thursday after that, she sat me down at the kitchen table with 2 glasses of milk and a plate of graham crackers, and she told me she was going to be sick for a while. I was 10. I did not understand what she meant by a while. I thought a while was the length of a flu. A while turned out to be 14 months. She wore the ring every day of those 14 months. Even at the end when her fingers had gone thin and the band kept turning the wrong way on her knuckle, she wore it. She would adjust it without looking. The way she would adjust her hair without a mirror. The way she would adjust me without raising her voice. She gave me 3 things before she died, formally, sitting up in the hospital bed in the den that the hospice company had delivered in November. She gave me her pearl earrings, the small ones she had worn at her wedding. She gave me a leather-bound copy of Charlotte's Web that her own mother had read to her in 1973. And she gave me her ring. Not to wear, Eleanor. To keep. For when you are old enough. She put it in a small velvet pouch, navy blue drawstring, and she pressed it into my hand, and she said the rest of it quietly so my father, asleep in the chair on the other side of the bed, would not wake. Your grandmother gave this to me when I turned 30. Her mother had given it to her. It has been on the hand of a Whitfield woman since 1952. 3 generations. You are the 4th. Keep it safe until you understand what it means. I was 11 years old. I did not understand what it meant. I understood only that my mother was leaving, and that she had decided I was old enough to be trusted with something that had outlasted her grandmother, and would outlast her too. I put the pouch in the bottom drawer of my dresser under a stack of sweaters that no longer fit. I checked on it every night for 2 years. I knew it was there the way you know your own pulse. My mother died on the morning of December 19, 2009, 6 days before Christmas. The funeral was on the 22nd. My father did not cry at the service. He cried in the parking lot afterward, gripping the door handle of his Buick, and I stood beside him in a black coat that my Aunt Patricia had bought me 2 sizes too big so I could grow into it, and I waited for him to finish. He finished. He drove us home. He made grilled cheese sandwiches for dinner. He went to work the next morning. That was the part of him I learned first. He could put a thing down. He could put a thing down and walk away from it and never pick it up again. And the not picking it up was so complete that it began to seem as if the thing had never existed. I watched him do it with my mother's photographs over the next 2 years. Not all at once. One at a time. The wedding photo from the mantel was gone by spring. The graduation photo from the hallway was gone by summer. The candid of her in the garden, the one where she was laughing at something off camera, was gone by the second Christmas. I did not say anything. I was 12. I did not yet have the vocabulary for what I was watching. Renee came into our house when I was 13, and she came in the way some people come into rooms, as if the room had been waiting for them and had finally gotten around to admitting it. She was a colleague of my father's at the insurance firm. She was 36, divorced once, with 2 children from her first marriage. Mason was 9 and Ainsley was 7. Renee had short blonde hair cut in a bob she touched up every 6 weeks at the same salon, and she wore a small gold cross around her neck on a chain so thin you could only see it when the light caught it. She was pleasant. She brought casseroles. She asked me about school in the careful, even voice of a woman who had read a book about how to talk to a grieving stepdaughter and had taken notes. I did not dislike her. That was the most surprising thing looking back. I did not dislike her at all. I was 13 and I was tired and I had been the woman of a house for 2 years, microwaving dinners, signing my own permission slips, lying to my father about whether I had eaten, and a woman who could make a casserole and ask me about school felt, in those first months, like the small kindness of a season finally ending. They were married 8 months after they started dating. The ceremony was at the county courthouse on a Wednesday. Renee wore a cream suit. My father wore the blue tie my mother had given him for his 40th birthday. He had kept the tie. He had thrown out the photo of him wearing the tie at the birthday dinner, but he had kept the tie, and he wore it on the day he married someone else, and at 13 I did not yet know how to read that. The first thing Renee changed was the kitchen. She did it slowly the way my father had done the photos. The dish towels were the first to go. The ones my mother had embroidered with small flowers in the corner. They disappeared one Saturday morning, and when I asked, Renee smiled and said they had been threadbare and she had bought us new ones, and the new ones were striped and white and from a chain store, and they were fine. They were fine. The china came next. The Wedgwood that my mother had collected piece by piece over the years of her marriage, the pattern with the small blue cornflowers around the edge, was rearranged onto the top shelf of the cabinet over the refrigerator where you needed a step stool to reach it. The everyday plates that took its place were beige and rimmed in gold and bought as a set. By the time I was 15, my mother's kitchen had become Renee's kitchen, and I had not raised my voice once, and my father had not noticed, and Mason and Ainsley had moved into the upstairs bedrooms, and the wallpaper in the hallway had been replaced with paint, and my mother's name had stopped being said out loud in the house at all. I went to college. I stayed there for 4 years. I came home for holidays the way you come back to a place you used to live, with a duffel bag and a polite distance. I majored in chemistry because my mother had been a high school chemistry teacher before the diagnosis, and I did not tell anyone in my new life that this was why, because it sounded like the kind of thing a daughter who had not done the work of moving on would say. I got a job teaching at Brookline Regional in the next county over the year I turned 23. I rented a small apartment above a bakery on the main street of a town nobody had heard of. The rent was cheap. The bread smelled good in the mornings. I had a cat named Bunsen after the burner, and a roommate I had stopped having after the second year, and a quiet life that fit me the way my mother's coat would have fit me if she had lived to give it to me. I came home for Easter that year because my father called on a Sunday afternoon and said, "Ellie, it would mean a lot to me if you came." He had not called me Ellie since I was 11. I should have known something was wrong then. I did not. I drove home. The ring caught the light when she reached for the casserole, and the light was the afternoon light coming through the dining room window, And the light was the same light that had come through that window when I was 8 and my mother had stood at the sideboard in a yellow dress trimming the stems of tulips for the table. I went still. I did not look at the ring directly. I looked at the casserole. I took the serving spoon. I lifted out a portion. I set it on my plate. I passed the dish to Mason on my left. Picked up my fork. I cut a piece of ham. Across the table, Ainsley was telling a story about her sorority. She was 20 now. She had grown into a young woman who used the word literally too often and laughed in a way that made the centerpiece tremble. Mason was 22, working at my father's firm, wearing a sweater that I suspected my father had paid for. Renee was nodding along and adding small encouraging sounds, and her left hand rested on the table next to her wine glass, and the emerald turned slowly in the sun. It was on the wrong hand. That was the second thing I noticed. My mother had worn it on her right because she had been left-handed, and she had said once that wedding rings on the dominant hand got beaten up. Renee was wearing it on her left because she was right-handed and because to her it was a wedding ring, and that meant my father had given it to her. And that meant my father had given it to her recently enough that I would notice on my first visit in 8 months. I cut another piece of ham. I asked Ainsley a question about her major. I listened to the answer. I smiled at the right places. My pulse was slow. My pulse has always been slow when something is wrong. That is the thing about being raised by a man who could put things down. You learn to put your own things down too. You learn to put them down while they are still inside you, and you learn to walk around with them without showing the weight. After dinner, I helped Renee clear the table. She handed me the dishes one at a time. The plates first, then the serving bowls, then the silverware. Her left hand was bare now. She had taken the ring off to do the dishes. I saw it on the windowsill above the sink. Sitting in the small ceramic dish she kept her rings in when she cooked. The emerald was darker without the table light on it. The cornflower blue of the inscription's underside caught my eye even from across the room. "That's a beautiful ring," I said. Renee looked at her hand. She had forgotten she had taken it off. She smiled. "Your father gave it to me for our anniversary in February. 12 years. She paused. "I think it was his mother's. He found it in a box in the attic. His mother's, not mine." I dried a plate. I set it in the rack. I dried another plate. "That's lovely," I said. "It looks old." He had it cleaned. There was an inscription inside. But the jeweler said it was from the 1950s, and we left it because removing it would have damaged the band. She did not know what the inscription said. She did not know that the inscription read CW always, that the CW was my mother's initials, that the always was my father's promise to a woman he had buried 15 years ago, and had now decided to forget so thoroughly that he had taken the symbol of his promise to her and given it to the woman who had replaced her. He had not given it to her on their anniversary. Their anniversary had been in February. The ring had been in my dresser drawer in the navy velvet pouch, under a stack of sweaters that had once again gone out of fashion, until I had moved out 4 years ago and had taken it with me and had kept it in the small fireproof safe in the closet of my apartment above the bakery. I had checked it at Christmas. I checked it every Christmas. It was still there at Christmas. Which meant the ring on Renee's windowsill was not my mother's ring. Which meant it was a copy. Which meant my father had had a copy made. Which meant my father had had to see the original to have a copy made. I dried another plate. I drove home that night with my hands at 10 and 2 and the radio off and the speedometer at exactly the limit. I do not remember the drive. I remember pulling into the lot behind the bakery and sitting in the car for a long time with the engine off and the windows up and the smell of yeast coming through the vents. I remember climbing the stairs to my apartment. I remember unlocking the door. I remember the cat winding around my ankles and meowing for food and my hands going through the motions of opening a can while my mind sat very still in a small room I had not visited in 15 years. I went to the closet. I opened the safe. I took out the navy velvet pouch. The ring was inside. It was my mother's ring. The emerald was the deep cool green the first remembered. The trillion diamonds caught the lamplight the way they had caught the kitchen light when my mother had washed dishes in 2008. The inscription on the inside reads CW always. I turned the ring in my fingers. I held it under the desk lamp. The setting was correct. The band was correct. The weight was correct. It was real. The ring on Renee's hand had also looked real. The emerald had looked correct. The diamonds had looked correct. The band had looked correct. I am a chemistry teacher. I know what I know. I do not know jewelry. I know that a skilled jeweler with a photograph and access to similar materials can produce a copy that would fool a casual observer, including a daughter who had not seen the original in 15 years and had spent the entire afternoon trying not to stare. But for a copy to be made, someone had to provide the photograph, or the original, or detailed measurements, or all three. My father had seen the ring only once in 15 years, at the funeral, when my mother had been wearing it in the casket. The funeral director had removed it before the burial and returned it to my father in a small white box, and my father had handed the box to me 3 days later without opening it. And he had said, "Your mother wanted you to have this." I had opened the box. I had taken out the ring. I had put it in the velvet pouch. He had not seen it since. Unless he had. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time. The cat got onto my lap and went to sleep. The clock on the nightstand moved from 11:14 to 11:38 to 12:02. I did not call anyone. I did not text anyone. I made a list in my head, the way I made lists when a student's lab results did not match the equation. I wrote the variables down on a notepad. The ring on Renee's hand was either a copy or the real ring, with mine being the copy. Probability that mine was the copy: very low. The pouch had not been opened by anyone but me. The box had been sealed when my father handed it over, and the jeweler my mother had used had been her grandmother's jeweler in a town an hour away, a man named Sol Hockman, who had been 71 when my mother died and was certainly retired or dead by now. The ring on Renee's hand was a copy. Someone had made the copy. The copy required information: photograph, measurement, drawing, or original. My father had access to none of those things, unless he had taken them when he had access to the original. He had access to the original for 3 days, from the funeral director's return of the ring to his handing it to me. 3 days in December 2009. He had had the ring photographed, or sketched, or sized. He had done it in those 3 days, and he had kept the documentation for 15 years, and at some point in those 15 years, he had used it to commission a copy. And then he had given the copy to Renee, and he had told her it was his mother's. And he had told her the inscription was an artifact of the 1950s that they had decided to leave intact. A man does not commission a copy of his dead wife's wedding ring for his second wife unless he is also doing other things. That was the only sentence I could write under the equation. A man does not do one quiet, calculated, expensive thing in isolation. He does it as part of a pattern. The copy was the visible part. There was something else. I called my Aunt Patricia at 7 o'clock the next morning. If you have ever discovered in a single ordinary afternoon that the parent who raised you has been quietly working against you for years, then you know the feeling of sitting in your apartment at midnight holding a ring that should not exist. If this is hitting close, drop a comment. Tell me. And if you have not yet, please subscribe. We are not at the worst of it yet. Patricia was my mother's older sister. She was 64 the year my mother died, and she was 79 the Easter I drove home. And she lived in a small house in the same town she had grown up in. And she had a garden, and she had a schnauzer named Tilly, and she had not been to my father's house since the wedding to Renee, and that absence had been deliberate on her part and never explained to me directly. She picked up on the second ring. She always picked up on the second ring. Eleanor. Patricia. I need to talk to you about something. Can I come down today? She did not ask why. She said, I have coffee. I taught my morning laps. I drove down at noon. I sat at her kitchen table with a mug between my hands, and I told her what I had seen at the dinner. I told her about the ring on Renee's hand and the ring in my safe. I told her my analysis. I told her my conclusion. Patricia listened. She did not interrupt. When I finished, she got up from the table and walked to her sideboard and opened the bottom drawer and took out a manila envelope that had been there long enough that the flap had set into a permanent curl. She put it on the table between us. I have been waiting 15 years for you to come ask me a question, she said. I did not know what the question would be. I knew it would come. I did not open the envelope. What is it? Photographs. Documents. The names of 2 people in your life that you do not know about. I made copies of everything your mother gave me before she died. She asked me to hold them until you came to me on your own. She said if you came on your own, it meant you were ready. Ready for what? Patricia took a slow breath. Her hand on the envelope was steady. It had been steady the day of my mother's funeral, too. Patricia was the kind of woman who held still when other people shook. To know what your father has been doing with your mother's estate. I opened the envelope. The first photograph was of my mother at her own mother's house in 1991, holding the ring up to the camera the day she had been given it. The lighting was the gauzy lighting of an early 90s instant photo. Her hair was in a banana clip. She was laughing. The ring was on her right hand because she had still been left-handed. The second photograph was a professional photograph of the ring on a velvet pad, taken at a jeweler's. The kind of photograph an insurance company requires for a high-value item. The date stamp in the corner read August 14, 2007, 2 years before my mother's diagnosis. The third photograph was a copy of an insurance appraisal. The ring had been valued at $47,000 in 2007. The appraiser was Sol Hockman, who, according to a note Patricia had written on a sticky tab attached to the page, had died in 2014. The fourth photograph was an insurance policy. My mother's name was on the policy. The policy had been transferred to my father's name as the surviving spouse in January 2010. The premium had been paid annually since. He insured the ring, I said. He insured the ring, Patricia said. He has been paying $312 a year to insure a ring he gave to his daughter. For 15 years. That is $4,680 in premiums on an item he claims he does not possess. I read the policy more carefully. The named insured was David Whitfield. The covered item was described as a platinum and emerald ring, oval-cut emerald approximately 6.2 millimeters, 2 flanking trillion diamonds approximately 0.45 carats each, engraved CW always inside band, valued at $52,000 with the most recent reappraisal in 2019. He had it reappraised in 2019, I said. He had something reappraised in 2019, Patricia said. Whether it was the original or his copy, I cannot say. But Sol Hockman was dead by 2019, and the appraiser on this document is a man named Lorne Fenway, who has an office in the strip mall on Route 9 between the nail salon and the bagel place. She let me read. She let me read for a long time. Then she pulled out the second document. It was my mother's will. I had seen my mother's will. I had been shown a copy at age 18 when my father had told me there was nothing in it that pertained to me yet because I was still a minor when she had died and the trust she had set up had been folded into the household estate. I remembered the conversation. I remembered the lawyer's office. I remembered the way my father had spoken slowly to me about how complicated estate law could be. This will did not match the one I remembered. The will Patricia handed me named a separate trust, the Catherine and Whitfield Trust for the benefit of Eleanor Marie Whitfield. The corpus of the trust was listed at $340,000 at the time of my mother's death, consisting of an investment account my mother had funded during her teaching career, the deed to a small lake cottage in the next county that had belonged to my mother's grandmother, and a life insurance policy with my mother as the policy holder and me as the sole beneficiary. The trustee was my father. The trust was to remain in his control until I turned 25, at which point full beneficial ownership was to transfer to me with a full accounting of all assets, expenditures, and distributions during the period of trusteeship. I had turned 25 the year before. My father had not given me an accounting. My father had not given me the assets. My father had not mentioned the trust. I looked up at Patricia. She was watching me the way you watch someone you are about to hand a knife. How long have you had this? Your mother gave it to me in November of 2009, a month before she died. She told me she did not trust your father to administer it correctly. She asked me to hold a copy and to wait. She said you would either come to me or you would not, and if you came, I would give you everything. Why didn't you come to me? Patricia was quiet for a moment. She set her coffee down. Because she asked me not to. She said you needed to find your own footing first. She said you needed to be strong enough to do what would need to be done. She said if I came to you, you would do it for her. If you came to me, you would do it for yourself. I did not cry. I have not cried in 15 years over my mother, not since the parking lot after the funeral. I think something in me decided that day that the crying was finished and there would not be more. I do not know if that decision was healthy. I know it was made. What else is in the envelope? I asked. Quarterly statements from the investment account. Your mother had me set up forwarding when she was sick. The statements come to a post office box in my name. I have 60 of them. They go up to last month. I took out the most recent statement. The account had been worth $340,000 in December 2009. In April of this year, the most recent statement, it was worth $11,247. He's been draining it, I said. For 15 years, Patricia said. Withdrawals of $3,000 to $8,000 at a time, 2 or 3 times a year. I marked the dates. They line up with Renee's birthdays, Mason's tuition payments, Ainsley's tuition payments, a kitchen renovation in 2017, a Caribbean cruise in 2019, a second mortgage paydown in 2021. I looked at the columns. Patricia had highlighted the withdrawals in yellow. The yellow ran down the side of the document like a wound. The lake house. Sold in 2014. Listed under a holding company called Whitfield Family Properties LLC. Sale price $189,000. The proceeds went into a joint account in your father's and Renee's names. The life insurance? Cashed out in 2015. He surrendered the policy. The cash value was $76,000. It paid for the kitchen renovation and Mason's first 2 years of college. I put my hands flat on the table. I was not shaking. My hands have always been steady. My students used to comment on it during lab demonstrations. Ms. Whitfield's hands never shake. I never told them why. Patricia. Eleanor. What do you need me to do? She picked up her coffee. She took a sip. She set it down. You need to call a lawyer. Not your father's. Not anyone in this county. There is a woman in Richmond named Adelaide Marsh. She practices estate law and she handles cases like this, and she has known me for 30 years because she was your mother's college roommate. I have already told her your name. I have already told her I would be sending you. She is expecting your call. My mother's college roommate. I had not heard that name in 15 years either. Adelaide Marsh. My mother had said it sometimes at the breakfast table, telling stories about a girl who had once dyed her hair green at a sorority formal and gotten away with it because she had memorized the dean's wife's name. The girl had grown up. The girl was a lawyer. The girl had been waiting too. All right, I said. Eleanor. Yes. You will need to be patient. You will need to be patient in a way that will not feel like patience. It will feel like swallowing glass. You cannot let your father know that you know. Not until everything is in place. Adelaide will tell you what everything means. Until she does, you go home, you teach your classes, you call your father on Sunday like nothing is wrong. Do you understand? Yes. You have been quiet your whole life, Eleanor. Your mother knew that about you. She told me it would be your protection. I think she was right. I folded the documents. I put them back in the envelope. I drove home. Adelaide Marsh's office was in a renovated Victorian on the edge of Richmond. The shutters were painted a deep green. There was a brass plaque next to the door that read Marsh & Associates, Estate and Trust Law. Inside, the floors were original pine and the receptionist was a woman in her 50s named Beverly who looked at me when I walked in and said, Eleanor, Adelaide is expecting you. Adelaide was 53. She had silver-streaked hair cut at her shoulders. She wore a navy suit and a small silver pendant in the shape of a moth. She had hung the moth around her neck the day she passed the bar in 1998. She told me later, because her favorite professor had called her one. A moth, the professor had said, is the only insect that can find a flame in total darkness. She sat across from me at a large oak desk. She had a yellow legal pad. She wrote down everything I said. When I was finished, she leaned back in her chair and folded her hands. Your father has committed multiple breaches of fiduciary duty. He has also potentially committed wire fraud, mail fraud, insurance fraud, and aggravated identity theft. The ring alone, depending on whether the original is in your possession, and whether the copy on Renee's hand was made using your mother's likeness or estate records, could carry separate charges. She paused. How would you like to proceed? I thought about my father carving the ham, the blue cable knit sweater, the way he had called me Ellie on the phone, the way he had cried in the parking lot of the funeral home 15 years ago, and had not cried since. I want everything back, I said. I want a full accounting. I want the assets restored. I want him to know that I know. I do not want to prosecute. I do not want him in prison. Why not? Because he is my father. Because my mother loved him once. Because prosecuting him would make Renee a sympathy figure, and I do not want her in the position of being able to play that hand. And because the recovery is what matters. The recovery and the truth. Adelaide nodded slowly. That is a measured decision, she said. I will tell you that most people in your position want the criminal referral. I will also tell you that the criminal route is often less effective than the civil one for actual recovery, because criminal proceedings tie up assets for years and the victim sees pennies. The civil route, with proper leverage, can be quieter and more complete. You have the leverage. You have an entire chain of documented theft, and you have an insurance policy on an item your father claims to have gifted to his daughter. The insurance fraud alone is criminal, but you can hold it. You can hold it the way you would hold a card. How long will this take? 8 weeks to build the case. 2 weeks to prepare the demand. The demand itself will be a sit-down meeting at this office. Your father, his attorney if he chooses, you, me. We will present the evidence. We will present the demand. We will give him 14 days to comply. If he complies, we close the matter civilly. If he does not, we refer to the district attorney and to the state insurance fraud division simultaneously. 8 weeks. 8 weeks to make sure we do not miss anything. You will have to keep going to Sunday dinners. You will have to keep calling on his birthday. You will have to be the same daughter you have always been until I tell you it is time. I thought about the ring. I thought about the copy on Renee's windowsill. I thought about the inscription she did not know about. I can do that, I said. She handed me a folder. This is a retainer agreement. Read it tonight. Sign it tomorrow. Beverly will set up the next meeting. From now on, you will come here every Tuesday at 4. We will go through the documents one section at a time. You will not photocopy anything you take home. You will not store anything on cloud services. You will not tell anyone what we are doing, including your closest friend, including any boyfriend, including your principal, including the cat. I almost smiled. Bunsen does not gossip. Bunsen has not been audited. Eleanor, this is the part of the case where people make their first mistake. They cannot resist telling one person. The one person tells another. Within 6 weeks, your father has heard a rumor and we have lost the element of surprise. You are not allowed to lose the element of surprise. Do you understand? Yes. She slid a pen across the desk. Then we begin. The 8 weeks pass the way weeks pass when you are pretending. I called my father every Sunday at 7 o'clock the way I had always called him. I asked about the firm. I asked about Mason's job. I let him tell me about a vacation he and Renee were planning for August. I said, "That sounds nice, Dad." I drove home for his birthday in May. I sat at the same table where I had seen the ring. I noticed that Renee was wearing it again. She wore it most days now, apparently. She had stopped putting it in the dish on the windowsill. She wore it to bed. I asked her once at the kitchen counter while she was making coffee what made it special to her. "It's the only thing he's ever given me from his family," she said. "Mason and Ainsley aren't his blood. He's been good to them, but the ring is the only thing that's like a real heirloom. Like I belong now." I told her it was beautiful. I drove home that night and called Adelaide and added the conversation to the file. We met every Tuesday at 4. Adelaide walked me through the document trail piece by piece. The investment account had been drained through a series of small withdrawals, each one staying below the threshold that would have triggered an internal review at the brokerage. The lake house had been sold through an LLC my father had formed in Delaware that he had not disclosed on his federal tax returns. The life insurance surrender had been signed by my father using his power of attorney as trustee, which was legal under the trust terms, but the proceeds had not been deposited into the trust account. They had been deposited directly into his and Renee's joint checking. Adelaide called it self-dealing. She used the word 4 times in 3 sentences. She wrote it on the legal pad in capital letters. The ring was the strangest piece. Adelaide could not, on paper, prove the ring on Renee's hand was a copy without examining it. We could not examine it without alerting my father. We could, however, prove that the ring my father had insured was not the ring he claimed to have gifted to his daughter, because I still possessed the gifted ring and it had not been in his possession since 2009. That was the lever. "We are going to walk into the meeting with the insurance policy," Adelaide said. "We are going to ask him to produce the insured item. He will not be able to, or he will produce the copy. If he produces the copy, we will request the insurance appraisal documentation. If the appraisal photograph matches Renee's ring rather than yours, we have insurance fraud. If the appraisal photograph matches your ring, we have a forged document. Either way, the ring is the noose. She used that word. The noose. I remember thinking that for a woman with a moth around her neck, she had a stark vocabulary. By the 8th week, we had a binder. Tab 1, the trust documents. Tab 2, 15 years of brokerage statements with every unauthorized withdrawal highlighted. Tab 3, the deed records for the lake house, the LLC formation in Delaware, and the sale documents. Tab 4, the life insurance surrender form and the bank deposit confirmation showing the proceeds going into a joint account. Tab 5, the kitchen renovation receipts, the cruise booking, the tuition payment records for Mason and Ainsley at their respective universities. Tab 6, the ring insurance policy, the appraisal, and a notarized affidavit from me that I had been in continuous possession of the original ring since December 22, 2009. Tab 7, a calculation of total damages, including principal, lost interest at a conservative 4% over 15 years, and the value of the lake house at current market rates. The total was $1.42 million. Adelaide closed the binder. We are ready. Beverly will call your father's office Monday morning and request a meeting on Wednesday afternoon. We will say it is a routine estate matter related to your mother's trust. We will not say more than that. Your father may bring counsel. Most people in his position do. What if he does not come? He will come. He has not been worried about your mother's trust in 15 years. He is not going to start worrying now. He will assume it is something he can talk his way through. That is the assumption we are relying on. Most people in his position have grown comfortable in their narrative. I called my father on Sunday. I told him I would not be coming home for Mother's Day next weekend because I had a curriculum review meeting at school. He said he understood. He said Renee would miss me. He said he loved me. I said I loved him too. I hung up. I put the phone down. I sat on the couch and held the cat and waited for Wednesday. If you have ever spent 8 weeks pretending nothing was wrong while you built the case that would change everything, you know that the strangest feeling is not anger. It is silence. A specific quality of silence. The kind that comes when you have stopped pretending to yourself even though you have to keep pretending to everyone else. Drop a comment. Tell me. And if you have not already, hit subscribe. Wednesday is next. My father walked into Adelaide's office at 2 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon in June. He was wearing a gray suit and the blue tie my mother had given him for his 40th birthday. He had not brought an attorney. He had brought, instead, a single manila folder and the expression of a man who believed he was doing his daughter a favor by coming. Adelaide stood and shook his hand. She introduced herself as my attorney. She did not say the word attorney loudly. She said it the way a doctor would say the word tumor in a corridor. He sat down. He looked at me. He smiled. Ellie. That. He set the folder on the table. Beverly said this was a trust matter. I brought what I have. Adelaide opened our binder. She did not look at his folder. Mr. Whitfield. Before we begin, I would like to confirm a few facts on the record. You served as trustee of the Catherine and Whitfield Trust for the benefit of Eleanor Marie Whitfield from December 19, 2009, until the trust's distribution date, which under the terms of the trust occurred on Eleanor's 25th birthday last year. Is that correct? My father blinked. He had not expected the trust to be named so precisely. Yes, I served as trustee. And under the terms of the trust on Eleanor's 25th birthday, you were required to deliver to Eleanor a full accounting of the trust corpus, all withdrawals, all distributions, and the current asset balance. Is that correct? I assumed so. I would have to look at the documents. Adelaide slid a copy of the trust across the table. Tab 1. She had flagged the relevant paragraph. Page 7. Section 4.2. He read it. His face did not change. His hands did not shake. My father in this regard was my father. We were both still under pressure. I had intended to do an accounting when Eleanor turned 25. The year got away from me. Mr. Whitfield, the year ended 4 months ago. We are now 7 months past the distribution date. Eleanor has not received an accounting. She has not received the assets. She has not received any communication from you regarding the trust at all in 15 years. Is that correct? He looked at me. I held his gaze. Eleanor and I have a close relationship, he said. We did not need formal communications for her to know that her interests were being managed. That is your characterization. Eleanor's characterization is different. But characterization is not what we are here to discuss. Let me show you a few documents. She turned to tab 2. She walked him through the brokerage statements. She did it slowly. She highlighted with the tip of her pen each withdrawal. She did not name the corresponding purchase yet. She let him watch the yellow line accumulate down the page. By the third statement, his face had begun to change. Not dramatically. A small shift. A tightening around the eyes. The expression of a man recalculating which direction the conversation was going. There have been household expenses, he said. The trust was structured to cover Eleanor's living expenses during her minority. I used it appropriately. Mr. Whitfield, Eleanor turned 18 in March of 2017. Withdrawals from this account did not stop in 2017. They continued through April of this year. Page 14 of tab 2 documents withdrawals totaling $187,400 occurring after Eleanor's 18th birthday. I would have to look at the trust language. I have it open in front of me. Page 9. Section 5.1. After the beneficiary reaches the age of 18, distributions may only be made directly to the beneficiary or with the beneficiary's written consent. Eleanor has provided no written consent for any distribution at any time. She turned to tab 3. The lake house. She showed him the LLC paperwork. She showed him the deed transfer. She showed him the sale price. That property belonged to my mother-in-law's family. It was Catherine's choice to do what she wanted with it. It was Catherine's choice to put it in trust for her daughter. The deed transfer to Whitfield Family Properties LLC occurred in 2014. The sole member of that LLC is you, Mr. Whitfield. You sold a property held in trust for your daughter, and you deposited the proceeds into your personal checking account. That is not a trust distribution. That is conversion. She turned to tab 4. The life insurance. The surrender form. The bank deposit. He did not respond this time. She turned to tab 5. The renovation. The cruise. The tuition payments for Mason at Ohio State and Ainsley at Northwestern. The kitchen island that had replaced my mother's. The Caribbean cruise photographs, which Adelaide had pulled from Renee's public social media account, with date stamps that matched the withdrawal dates on the brokerage statements. She turned to tab 6. She did it slowly. She set the insurance policy on the table first. She slid it toward him. Can you confirm that this is your signature on the policyholder line? He looked at it. He did not pick it up. Yes. Can you confirm that this policy insures a platinum and emerald ring engraved CW always inside the band? Yes. Can you confirm that this policy has been continuously maintained since January of 2010? Yes. Can you produce the insured item, Mr. Whitfield? He sat very still. I had wondered in the weeks leading up to this moment what his face would do. I had thought maybe he would deny. I had thought maybe he would try to manufacture an explanation on the spot. I had thought maybe he would lie about which ring was which. He did none of those things. He sat very still and he looked at the table. The expression on his face was the expression he had worn in the parking lot of the funeral home 15 years ago. It was the expression of a man who has just understood that something he has been carrying alone is no longer his to carry. "Eleanor has the ring," he said. "Yes," Adelaide said. "Eleanor has had the ring since you gave it to her, in compliance with your wife's wishes, on December 22, 2009. Eleanor's notarized affidavit attesting to this is on the next page." "Then why does Renee have?" He stopped. He understood mid-sentence what he was about to say. "Mr. Whitfield," Adelaide said gently, "we already know." She slid the appraisal photograph across the table. The 2019 reappraisal. The photograph showed a ring. The ring in the photograph had a setting that was slightly different from my mother's. The trillion diamonds were set lower. The band was a hair thicker. It was a good copy. It was a copy made by a competent jeweler with detailed reference photographs. It was not my mother's ring. It was the ring on Renee's hand. "You commissioned a copy," Adelaide said. "You commissioned it sometime between 2009 and 2019. You provided the jeweler with reference materials. You insured the copy under a policy that names the original. You have been paying premiums on a fraudulent insurance policy for at least 6 years, possibly longer, and you have been representing the copy to your current spouse as your mother's family heirloom, which it is not." My father looked at me. "Ellie, I am sorry." I said nothing. I had been told by Adelaide not to speak unless directly addressed. I was complying. Adelaide closed the binder. "Mr. Whitfield, here is what is going to happen. I am going to give you a written demand. You will have 14 days to comply. The demand has 3 components. 1. The immediate restoration to a new trust in Eleanor's name of the full principal value of the original trust, calculated with interest at 4% compounded annually over 15 years. That figure is $612,000. 2. The transfer to Eleanor of the proceeds from the sale of the lake house with interest, totaling $267,000. 3. The immediate surrender of the ring currently in Renee's possession, the cancellation of the insurance policy, and a written statement to Renee explaining that the ring is not what you represented it to be. I do not have that money. You have a house. You have a 401k. You have an investment account in your and Renee's joint names. You have access to credit. You have a means of producing the money. The means is your problem, not Eleanor's. Renee will leave me. That is also not Eleanor's problem." She paused. She let him sit with it. "If you do not comply within 14 days, this office will file a civil suit for breach of fiduciary duty, conversion, fraud, and insurance fraud. We will simultaneously refer the insurance fraud matter to the State Insurance Commission and the fraud matter to the district attorney. The criminal referral is at Eleanor's discretion. She has indicated that she would prefer not to make it. She has not ruled it out." He looked at me. "Ellie." I looked at him for a long time. I thought about the man who had made grilled cheese the day after my mother died. I thought about the man who had cried in the parking lot. I thought about the man who had taken down her photographs one at a time. I thought about the man who had commissioned a copy of her ring and had given it to another woman and had insured it under the original's identity. He was all of them. He was every one of those men. He had been every one of those men the whole time, and I had only seen the first one because I had been a child and the first one had been enough. "Dad," I said. I would like the money. I would like the ring. I would like the truth told to Renee in writing by you. After that, we can decide what we are to each other." He nodded. "All right. You have 14 days. He stood up. He picked up his folder, which he had not opened. He looked at Adelaide. He looked at me. He walked out of the office. Beverly closed the door behind him. Adelaide leaned back in her chair. "He will comply," she said. "How do you know?" "Because he is not a man who wants the rest of his life on a courtroom calendar. He is a man who wants quiet. He bought 15 years of quiet by stealing from you. He will buy the next 30 years of quiet by paying you back. He does not have it in him to fight this." I could see it the moment he sat down. She was right. He complied on day 11. The wire transfer for $879,000 hit the new trust account on a Tuesday morning at 9:14. The remaining balance, accounting for the joint assets he had pledged and the home equity loan he had taken against the Whitmore Heights house, was scheduled to follow in 4 installments over 6 months. Adelaide had agreed to the installment structure because she said, "A man who pays in installments stays scared longer." Renee left him on day 13. I learned about this from Patricia, who had run into a mutual acquaintance at the grocery store. The acquaintance had said that Renee had moved into a rental in Brookline. The acquaintance had said that Renee had told her 3 friends that David had stolen from his daughter for 15 years and had given her a fake ring. The acquaintance had said that Mason had taken a job in Atlanta and was not speaking to my father, and that Ainsley had moved back to her biological father's house in Pittsburgh. The Whitmore Heights house went on the market in August. My father moved into a 1-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaner in the town he had grown up in, 2 streets from the house his own mother had lived in until her death. He called me once a week. I let it go to voicemail for the first month. Then I started picking up. The conversations were short. We talked about my classes. We talked about the cat. We did not talk about Renee. We did not talk about the trust. We did not talk about the ring. I did not say I forgave him. I did not say I did not. I left the question of forgiveness in a small velvet pouch at the back of my own mind, the way my mother had left a ring in the back of her dresser drawer for me to find when I was ready to understand what it meant. I drove down to see Patricia at the end of the summer. I brought her a tomato from my window box. We sat on her back porch and drank coffee and watched Tilly the schnauzer chase a moth across the grass. "You did well, Eleanor," Patricia said. "My mother set it up so I could. Your mother knew what she was doing. She always knew what she was doing. You inherited that from her, you know. Not the ring. The not flinching." I thought about that. I thought about my mother in the hospital bed in the den, adjusting the band on her thin finger, telling me about 3 generations of Whitfield women, telling me to keep it safe until I understood what it meant. I had understood. I had understood it sitting at Adelaide's desk while my father went still. I had understood it when Adelaide had used the word noose. I had understood it the moment I had passed the green bean casserole and known, without looking up, that the ring on Renee's hand was a piece of theater. The ring meant a promise. Not the promise my father had made when he gave it to my mother. The promise my mother had made when she gave it to me. The promise that she would not let her daughter be erased the way she had been erased. She had not. She had given me the ring. She had given Patricia the documents. She had told Adelaide for months before she died, in a phone call I never knew about, that her old college roommate might one day be needed. I had been raised by 3 women without knowing it. My mother had been raising me even after she was gone. The cottage sold for $312,000 in the fall, and Adelaide had insisted that the sale proceeds plus interest go to the new trust regardless of what my father had already paid, because the cottage had never been his to sell. He paid that too. He paid it in November. I sold my apartment above the bakery and bought a small house on a lake in the next county. Not the lake my mother's cottage had been on. A different one. I did not want the original. I wanted a beginning of my own. I moved in on a Saturday in February, 2 days before what would have been my mother's 55th birthday. The cat came with me. The chemistry job came with me. The ring came with me in the velvet pouch in the fireproof safe, in the closet of my new bedroom that looked out over water. I took it out on her birthday. I put it on my right hand. Catherine Whitfield always. I wore it that day and the next day and the day after that. I have worn it every day since. The band has begun to wear smooth against my skin. The inscription has not faded. If this story has stayed with you, I want to hear from you. Have you ever discovered that the person who raised you was quietly working against you? Or maybe you are still carrying a small navy velvet pouch in a drawer somewhere, waiting to find out what it means. Drop it in the comments. I read every one. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story, share it. There are more like it on this channel. The link is in the description. Thank you for listening. I mean that.